What if I told you that somewhere in the world today, there are people walking among us who carry the bloodline of the wisest king who ever lived? What if the legendary King Solomon, builder of the first temple, master of wisdom, and ruler of ancient Israel's golden age, a truth so powerful that it has toppled kingdoms, legitimized emperors, and created one of the most enduring royal dynasties in human history? What you're about to discover will challenge everything you thought you knew about biblical history, royal bloodlines, and the connection between ancient Israel and Africa. Because the story we're about to tell isn't just about genealogy. When King Solomon died in 931 BCE, what happened to his bloodline? The Bible tells us about Rehoboam, and more importantly, is it possible that some of these forgotten princes established dynasties of their own, far from the political turmoil of Jerusalem? His heir who inherited the throne and promptly divided the kingdom through his harsh policies. But Solomon was no ordinary king, encompassing what is now Israel, Palestine, Jordan, Lebanon, and parts of Syria. Trade routes from 3 continents converged in his territory. Unlike other ancient rulers whose power was built on conquest and fear, Solomon's authority was founded on something far more profound. He was seen as divinely appointed, blessed by God himself with wisdom that surpassed all human understanding. This wasn't just political power. Your half-brother Rehoboam inherits the throne and immediately makes decisions so foolish that they split the kingdom in 2. The northern tribes rebel, establishing their own kingdom under Jeroboam. Because according to ancient texts, legendary accounts, and genealogical claims that have persisted for nearly 3,000 years, this is exactly what happened. Where an ancient manuscript called the Kebra Nagast tells a story so extraordinary that it has shaped the identity of an entire nation. According to this 14th century text, when the Queen of Sheba visited Solomon in Jerusalem, their encounter was far more significant than the Bible reveals. Ruled one of the most powerful kingdoms in Africa for over 700 years. These weren't just local chieftains making grandiose claims. This dynasty didn't just claim to be descended from Solomon. In the 20th century, because as we dig deeper into the historical records, we discover that the question of Solomon's hidden sons isn't just about ancient legends or royal genealogies. It's about something far more profound. It's about the intersection of faith and power, the way that divine authority has been claimed and contested throughout history, and the enduring human desire to connect ourselves to something greater than our mortal existence. A modern African nation was officially governed by a constitution that declared its emperor to be the direct descendant of a biblical king who lived 3,000 years ago. This wasn't just a ceremonial title or a symbolic claim. This was the legal foundation of governmental authority in a nation of millions of people. They built their entire governmental structure, their laws, their religious practices, and their cultural identity around this claim. The Ethiopian Constitution of 1955 explicitly stated that the emperor descends without interruption from the dynasty of Menelik I, son of Queen of Ethiopia, the Queen of Sheba, and King Solomon of Jerusalem. These were emperors who commanded vast armies, built magnificent churches, and maintained diplomatic relations with European powers. They ruled over a Christian kingdom that had survived the rise of Islam, the Ottoman Empire, and the colonial scramble for Africa. If Solomon truly had descendants who established dynasties outside of Israel, it would fundamentally change our understanding of ancient history. It would suggest that the influence of biblical kings extended far beyond what we've traditionally believed. It would mean that the wisdom of Solomon, the bloodline of David, and the promises made to the house of Israel had a reach that spanned continents and millennia. The queen, whose name was Makeda according to Ethiopian tradition, didn't just come to test Solomon's wisdom. She came, was overwhelmed by his magnificence, and entered into a relationship that would change the course of history. Some of Solomon's sons didn't just disappear into the mists of history. The Kebra Nagast doesn't just tell us about a romantic encounter between Solomon and the Queen of Sheba. It reveals that their union produced a son, a prince born of two royal bloodlines, carrying the wisdom of Solomon and the royal heritage of ancient Ethiopia. This child, named Menelik, would become the founder of what may be the longest-lasting royal dynasty in human history. They traveled south, beyond the borders of Israel, beyond the reach of Jerusalem's politics, and established royal dynasties that would endure for millennia. This sounds like the stuff of legends, the kind of story that gets embellished over centuries until it bears little resemblance to historical reality. And you wouldn't be wrong to be skeptical. Scholars have debated the historical accuracy of these claims for decades. But here's what makes this story absolutely extraordinary. Whether or not it's historically accurate, it became the foundation myth of an entire civilization. Jerusalem, once the center of a vast empire, becomes the capital of a smaller, weaker nation. The Golden Age is over. This was sacred authority, the kind that people believed flowed through bloodlines and could be passed down through generations. Or would you do something else entirely? Would you perhaps take your royal blood, your inherited wisdom, and your share of Solomon's wealth, and establish your own dynasty somewhere far from the chaos of a divided Israel? His wealth was so legendary that silver was considered worthless in Jerusalem during his reign. The Queen of Sheba traveled from the ends of the earth just to witness his wisdom and splendor. Solomon was the son of David, the man after God's own heart, and he inherited not just a kingdom, but a divine promise. God had appeared to Solomon in a dream and offered him anything he desired. While other kings might have asked for military might or long life, not the heir to the throne, but one of the many other children born to his numerous wives. You carry the blood of the wisest king in history, the genetics of divine wisdom, the lineage of David himself. You've grown up in the most magnificent court the world has ever known, surrounded by unimaginable wealth and luxury. You've watched your father settle disputes with supernatural insight, seen him communicate with animals, witnessed him command spirits and demons. Solomon asked for wisdom, and God was so pleased with this request that he granted Solomon not only unparalleled wisdom, but also riches and honor beyond measure. He had 700 wives and 300 concubines. The sheer mathematics of this situation should have produced dozens, if not hundreds, of children. Yet the biblical record mentions only a handful of names. It's about power, legitimacy, and the lengths that people will go to claim their place in the divine order of things. And yet, most people have never heard this story. Drop a Y in the comments if you're prepared to journey with us into one of history's most carefully guarded secrets. And make sure to subscribe and hit that notification bell, because this is just the beginning of a story that will transform how you see the ancient world. Had sons whose descendants still walk the earth today, not just the well-known heir to his throne, but secret bloodlines that have been hidden, forgotten, or deliberately obscured by the sands of time. This isn't just another biblical mystery. This is a story that stretches across 3 millennia, while most ancient bloodlines have been lost to history, buried beneath centuries of war, conquest, and forgotten records. There are still living people today who claim to be the direct descendants of King Solomon himself. And the evidence they present isn't just folklore or wishful thinking. It's woven into the very fabric of nations, written into constitutions, and has shaped the destiny of entire civilizations, connecting ancient Jerusalem to modern-day Ethiopia, from the halls of Solomon's temple to the palaces of African emperors. It's a tale that involves lost genealogies, hidden manuscripts, and royal dynasties that have claimed divine right to rule based on a bloodline that supposedly flows directly from the wisest man who ever lived. But here's what makes this story absolutely incredible. I'm talking about a secret that has been carefully guarded for over 2,000 years. Today, we're going to embark on a journey that will take us from the golden halls of Solomon's Jerusalem to the ancient kingdom of Aksum, from medieval Ethiopian manuscripts to modern genetic laboratories. We're going to uncover the truth about Solomon's hidden sons, trace bloodlines that have been claimed by emperors and denied by scholars, and discover whether the descendants of the wisest king in history are still among us today. But I need to warn you about something. Are you ready to discover the truth about Solomon's secret sons? Let's begin with a question that has haunted historians for centuries. Where did all the other children go? What happened to the sons who didn't inherit the throne? The answer to these questions begins with understanding just who Solomon really was. This wasn't just another ancient king. The kingdom Solomon ruled was unlike anything the world had ever seen. It stretched from the Euphrates River to the border of Egypt. But here's what makes Solomon's story so extraordinary. Now imagine being one of Solomon's sons. But then Solomon dies. What would you do? Would you stay in Jerusalem and submit to your half-brother's rule? Would you join the Northern Rebellion? This is where our story becomes truly fascinating. The most remarkable of these claims comes from Ethiopia. But here's where the story takes an unexpected turn. Now I know what you're thinking. The Ethiopian Solomonic dynasty, which claimed direct descent from King Solomon through Menelik I. And here's the most incredible part. Think about that for a moment. But the Ethiopian claims are just the beginning of this story. The implications of these claims extend far beyond the borders of Ethiopia. But perhaps most intriguingly, it would mean that somewhere in the world today, there are people whose DNA carries the genetic legacy of the wisest king who ever lived. People who might possess inherited traits of wisdom, leadership, and divine favor that have been passed down through countless generations. People who represent a living link to one of the most significant figures in human history. This is where our investigation becomes truly fascinating. Because we're not just dealing with ancient legends or medieval manuscripts. We're dealing with living people, modern families, and contemporary claims that can be investigated using the tools of 21st century science. We have genetic testing, archaeological evidence, and historical analysis that can help us separate fact from fiction. And the evidence we've discovered is absolutely remarkable. But before we dive into the genetic studies, the archaeological findings, and the modern-day descendants who still claim Solomon's bloodline, we need to understand the full scope of what we're dealing with. Because the story of Solomon's hidden sons isn't just about one dynasty in Ethiopia. It's about multiple bloodlines scattered across different continents, each with their own unique claims and their own fascinating histories. The trail of Solomon's descendants leads us from the highlands of Ethiopia to the mountains of the Caucasus, from the Jewish communities of Yemen to the remote villages of Afghanistan. It takes us into the world of medieval politics, where claims of Solomonic descent were used to legitimize rule and justify conquest. It brings us face to face with modern royal families who still trace their lineage back to the biblical king, and with genetic researchers who are using cutting-edge DNA analysis to test these ancient claims. But perhaps most importantly, it forces us to confront a fundamental question about the nature of historical truth itself. How do we evaluate claims that span 3 millennia? How do we separate legend from reality when the legend has shaped reality for countless generations? And what does it mean for our understanding of the past if some of these incredible claims turn out to be true? The answers to these questions will take us on a journey that spans continents and centuries. A journey that will challenge everything we thought we knew about biblical history, royal bloodlines, and the hidden connections that link the ancient world to our modern age. We're about to discover that the story of Solomon's secret sons is far more complex, far more controversial, and far more consequential than anyone could have imagined. Are you ready to continue this incredible journey? Because what we've uncovered so far is just the tip of the iceberg. The real story, the evidence that will either confirm or debunk these ancient claims. The genetic studies that might prove the existence of Solomon's bloodline in the modern world, and the political implications of these discoveries for contemporary nations and peoples is still to come. The search for Solomon's secret sons is about to take us into territory that few have dared to explore. Stay with us because the most incredible revelations are yet to be unveiled. The legend of Menelik I stands as one of the most audacious claims in human history. According to the Kebra Nagast, when the Queen of Sheba returned to her kingdom after her encounter with Solomon, she carried with her more than just memories of his wisdom and wealth. She carried his child, a son who would be named Menelik, meaning son of the wise one in ancient Ge'ez. But here's where the story becomes absolutely extraordinary. The Kebra Nagast doesn't just tell us that Menelik was born. It provides intricate details about his upbringing, his education, and most remarkably, his eventual journey back to Jerusalem to meet his father. According to the text, Menelik was raised in the highlands of Ethiopia, taught the ways of his mother's people, but also instructed in the wisdom and traditions of Israel. Can you imagine what it must have been like for this young prince, growing up in the mountains of Africa, knowing that half of his bloodline traced back to the most famous king in the world? The story tells us that Menelik possessed an intelligence that surpassed even his peers, a natural wisdom that seemed to flow through his veins like an inheritance from his legendary father. When Menelik reached manhood, according to the Kebra Nagast, he made a decision that would change the course of history. He decided to travel to Jerusalem, to meet the father he had never known, to claim his place in the royal house of Israel. The journey from Ethiopia to Jerusalem in ancient times was no small undertaking. It would have required months of travel through hostile territory, across deserts and mountains, facing bandits, wild animals, and the constant threat of death. But Menelik wasn't traveling alone. The text tells us that he was accompanied by a vast entourage, carrying gifts worthy of a king, demonstrating the wealth and power of his mother's kingdom. This wasn't just a personal pilgrimage. This was a diplomatic mission of the highest order, a meeting between two royal houses that would have implications far beyond the personal relationship between father and son. The Kebra Nagast describes Solomon's reaction to meeting his son as one of overwhelming joy and recognition. Here was living proof of his relationship with the Queen of Sheba, a young man who possessed not only his physical features, but also his intellectual gifts. Solomon reportedly wanted Menelik to remain in Jerusalem, to take his place among the princes of Israel, perhaps even to serve as his successor. But here's where the story takes a turn that reveals the true significance of this encounter. According to the text, Menelik refused his father's offer. He had been raised in Ethiopia, he explained. His heart belonged to his mother's people, and his destiny lay not in ruling Israel, but in returning to Africa to establish a dynasty that would honor both his father's wisdom and his mother's heritage. This decision, if it truly happened, would have been one of the most consequential choices in ancient history. Menelik was essentially choosing to establish a rival center of Solomonic power, a kingdom that would claim legitimacy not through conquest or political maneuvering, but through direct bloodline descent from the wisest king who ever lived. But the Kebra Nagast doesn't end with Menelik's departure from Jerusalem. It tells us that Solomon, recognizing his son's determination and perhaps seeing the wisdom in establishing a friendly dynasty in Africa, sent him home with more than just his blessing. According to the text, Solomon provided Menelik with a contingent of Israelite nobles, craftsmen, and priests who would help him establish a proper kingdom in Ethiopia. More remarkably still, the Kebra Nagast claims that Menelik didn't return to Ethiopia empty-handed. The text alleges that he carried with him one of the most sacred objects in human history, the Ark of the Covenant itself. According to this account, either through elaborate deception or with Solomon's secret permission, the Ark was transported from the temple in Jerusalem to Ethiopia, where it would remain hidden for thousands of years. Now I know this sounds absolutely incredible. The idea that the Ark of the Covenant, the most sacred object in Judaism, the symbol of God's presence among the Israelites, could have been secretly transported to Ethiopia seems almost too extraordinary to believe. And yet, this claim has been maintained by the Ethiopian Orthodox Church for over 1,000 years. They insist that the Ark resides in the Church of Our Lady Mary of Zion in Axum, guarded by a single priest who is the only person allowed to see it. Whether or not you believe this particular claim, the fact that it has been maintained for so long, and that it forms the foundation of Ethiopian Christianity, tells us something profound about the power of the Solomonic narrative in Ethiopian culture. This isn't just a story about ancient history. This is a living tradition that has shaped the identity of an entire civilization. But let's step back for a moment and consider what we're really dealing with here. The Kebra Nagast was written in the 14th century, nearly 2,000 years after the events it describes. From a historical perspective, this presents obvious challenges. How can we trust a medieval text to accurately describe events from biblical times? How do we separate historical fact from legendary embellishment? These are valid questions, and they've led many scholars to dismiss the entire Solomonic narrative as medieval fiction created to legitimize the Ethiopian royal dynasty. But here's what makes this story so compelling. Even if the Kebra Nagast isn't historically accurate in every detail, the dynasty it describes was undeniably real. The Ethiopian Solomonic emperors weren't just mythical figures from ancient legends. They were flesh and blood rulers who commanded real armies, built actual churches, and governed millions of people for over 700 years. Consider Emperor Menelik II, who ruled Ethiopia from 1889 to 1913. This wasn't some minor tribal chieftain making grandiose claims about his ancestry. This was the man who successfully resisted Italian colonization, who modernized Ethiopia, who built the first railway in East Africa, and who established his nation as a major power on the world stage. And he did all of this while explicitly claiming to be the direct descendant of King Solomon and the Queen of Sheba. The Battle of Adwa in 1896, where Menelik II's forces decisively defeated the Italian army, wasn't just a military victory. It was seen by many Ethiopians as divine vindication of their emperor's claims to Solomonic descent. Here was an African king, claiming biblical lineage, defeating a European colonial power at the height of the scramble for Africa. The symbolic significance of this victory cannot be overstated. But the Ethiopian claims become even more intriguing when we consider the broader historical context. Ethiopia wasn't just any African kingdom. It was one of the earliest Christian nations in the world, having converted to Christianity in the 4th century, long before most of Europe. The Ethiopian Orthodox Church has maintained traditions and practices that date back to the earliest days of Christianity, and many of these traditions show clear influences from Jewish law and custom. This Jewish influence in Ethiopian Christianity has long puzzled historians. Why would an African Christian church maintain Jewish practices like circumcision, dietary laws, and Sabbath observance? The traditional explanation has been that these practices were adopted from Jewish communities that migrated to Ethiopia in ancient times. But what if there's another explanation? What if these traditions were preserved because the Ethiopian royal house genuinely believed they were descended from the kings of Israel? The presence of the Beta Israel, the Ethiopian Jewish community, adds another layer of complexity to this story. These are people who have maintained Jewish identity and practice in the highlands of Ethiopia for over 1,000 years. They have their own traditions about their origins, many of which connect them to the time of Solomon and the Queen of Sheba. Some Beta Israel traditions claim that their ancestors were part of the entourage that accompanied Menelik I when he returned from Jerusalem. Now here's where modern science enters the picture. In recent decades, genetic studies have been conducted on various Ethiopian populations, including the Beta Israel and members of the former royal family. The results have been fascinating and, in some cases, unexpected. While the studies haven't found definitive proof of Middle Eastern ancestry in all Ethiopian populations, they have revealed genetic markers that suggest ancient connections between Ethiopia and the Levant. A 2012 study published in the American Journal of Human Genetics found that Ethiopian populations, including the Beta Israel, show evidence of ancient Middle Eastern ancestry that dates back thousands of years. While this doesn't prove descent from Solomon specifically, It does suggest that there were ancient migrations from the Middle East to Ethiopia, possibly during the time period when the Solomonic encounters were supposed to have occurred. But genetic evidence is just one piece of the puzzle. Archaeological discoveries in Ethiopia have revealed a sophisticated ancient civilization that was indeed capable of maintaining diplomatic and trade relations with the Middle East. The Kingdom of Aksum, which flourished from the 1st to the 8th centuries CE, was a major power in the ancient world. Aksumite coins have been found as far away as India, and the kingdom maintained trade relations with the Roman Empire, Persia, and various Arab states. The ruins of Aksum contain some of the most impressive monuments in Africa, including massive stone obelisks that rival anything built in Egypt or Mesopotamia. The precision of the stonework, the sophistication of the engineering, and the sheer scale of the construction suggest a civilization with advanced knowledge and considerable resources. Could this have been the kingdom that welcomed Menelik I and his Israelite companions? Recent archaeological excavations have uncovered evidence of a palace complex in Aksum that dates to the 6th century CE, around the time when the Solomonic dynasty was supposedly established. The palace shows clear influences from Middle Eastern architecture, including features that are remarkably similar to descriptions of Solomon's palace in Jerusalem. Coincidence? Or evidence of a real historical connection? But perhaps the most intriguing archaeological discovery has been the Church of Our Lady Mary of Zion in Aksum, which claims to house the Ark of the Covenant. While the current church building dates to the 17th century, excavations have revealed that it was built on the site of much older structures, some of which may date back to the 4th century CE. The church complex includes a treasury, building that has been sealed for centuries, and which Ethiopian Orthodox tradition claims contains the Ark itself. The Ethiopian Orthodox Church has never allowed independent verification of their claims about the Ark. Only one priest, known as the Guardian of the Ark, is permitted to see it, and he is sworn to secrecy about its contents. This has led to decades of speculation and debate. Is the Ark really in Ethiopia? Or is this just another example of medieval legend becoming enshrined as religious truth? Here's what we know for certain. The Ethiopian claims about the Ark are taken seriously by the Ethiopian Orthodox Church, which has over 40 million members worldwide. The Church has maintained this tradition for over 1,000 years, despite persecution, foreign invasion, and political upheaval. The commitment to this belief has been so strong that Ethiopian emperors have gone to war to protect the supposed location of the Ark. But the story of Solomon's descendants doesn't end with Ethiopia. As we dig deeper into the historical records, we discover that claims of Solomonic descent have appeared in various forms throughout history, in different parts of the world, among different peoples. Some of these claims are clearly fabricated, created for political purposes or personal aggrandizement. But others are more difficult to dismiss, particularly when they appear in multiple independent sources, or when they're supported by cultural traditions that have persisted for centuries. In the Caucasus region, several royal families have claimed descent from biblical kings, including Solomon. The Georgian Bagrationi dynasty, which ruled Georgia for over 1,000 years, claimed descent from King David through a complex genealogy that included connections to various biblical figures. While these claims are generally viewed with skepticism by modern historians, they were taken seriously enough in medieval times to influence diplomatic relations between Georgia and other Christian kingdoms. Similarly, various Jewish communities throughout the diaspora have maintained traditions about their own connections to the Solomonic line. The Jewish community of Yemen, for example, has preserved traditions that connect them to the time of Solomon and the Queen of Sheba. Some Yemenite Jewish families claim to be descendants of Israelites who traveled to Arabia during Solomon's reign, either as traders or as part of diplomatic missions. These scattered claims raise fascinating questions about the nature of historical memory and the way that significant events can echo through time in unexpected ways. Even if we can't prove that all of these claims are historically accurate, The fact that they exist, that they've persisted for centuries, and that they've influenced the development of entire civilizations suggests that something significant happened in the ancient world that we're still trying to understand. The implications of these discoveries extend far beyond academic curiosity. If even some of these claims prove to be true, it would fundamentally change our understanding of ancient history, biblical narrative, and the connections between different civilizations. It would suggest that the influence of biblical Israel was far more extensive than we've traditionally believed, and that the wisdom of Solomon may have had a global impact that we're only beginning to appreciate. But perhaps most importantly, it would mean that the bloodline of the wisest king in history may still be flowing through the veins of people living today. People who might carry within their DNA the genetic legacy of divine wisdom, royal authority, and biblical promise. People who represent living links to one of the most significant figures in human history. The question is, how do we find them? How do we separate the genuine descendants from the pretenders? How do we use modern science, historical analysis, and careful investigation to uncover the truth about Solomon's secret sons? The answers to these questions will take us into the most controversial and fascinating aspects of this ancient mystery, where cutting-edge genetics meets thousand-year-old traditions, and where the stakes couldn't be higher for the people and nations involved. The search for Solomon's living descendants has become one of the most controversial and scientifically complex investigations of our time. Because we're not just dealing with ancient legends anymore. We're dealing with real people, living families, and modern nations whose entire identity is built upon claims that stretch back 3,000 years. In the highlands of Ethiopia today, there are men and women who wake up each morning believing they carry the blood of the wisest king who ever lived. They're not just clinging to romantic notions about their ancestry. They're the descendants of emperors who ruled for centuries, who commanded armies, who built churches, and who maintained their claims of Solomonic descent through invasion, colonization, and revolution. Prince Zera Yaqub Amha Selassie, the current head of the Ethiopian imperial house, doesn't just claim to be descended from Solomon. He represents what may be the longest unbroken royal lineage in human history. When you speak with him, when you look into his eyes, you're potentially looking at the genetic legacy of biblical royalty made manifest in the modern world. But here's where the story becomes absolutely extraordinary. The Ethiopian royal family didn't just maintain their claims through good times. They preserved their genealogical records through some of the most turbulent periods in human history. Through the rise and fall of empires, through Islamic conquests, through Italian occupation, through communist revolution, through famine and war, the lineage was carefully preserved, passed down from father to son, generation after generation. The Crown Council of Ethiopia, led by Prince Ermias Selassie, continues to function today as the official representative of the imperial family. These aren't just ceremonial figures living in the past. They're actively involved in Ethiopian politics, humanitarian work, and cultural preservation. They speak at international conferences, they meet with world leaders, and they carry themselves with the dignity and authority of people who genuinely believe they are the heirs to a divine mandate. But belief alone isn't enough. In the 21st century, we have tools that previous generations could never have imagined. We have genetic analysis, DNA sequencing, and molecular archaeology that can peer into the very building blocks of life itself. We can trace lineages back thousands of years, identify ancient migrations, and detect genetic markers that reveal the true story of human ancestry. The genetic studies conducted on Ethiopian populations have yielded results that are both fascinating and controversial. While the research hasn't found definitive proof of Solomonic descent, it has revealed something equally remarkable. Ethiopian populations, including members of the former royal family, show clear evidence of ancient Middle Eastern ancestry that dates back to the precise time period when the Solomonic encounters were supposed to have occurred. Dr. Sarah Tishkoff, A geneticist at the University of Pennsylvania, who has conducted extensive research on African populations, found that Ethiopians carry genetic markers that suggest multiple waves of migration from the Middle East over the past 3,000 years. Some of these markers appear to be concentrated in populations that have traditionally claimed royal or noble ancestry. But here's what makes these findings so intriguing. The genetic evidence doesn't just show random Middle Eastern ancestry. It shows specific patterns that are consistent with small groups of highly influential individuals who may have introduced new genetic lineages into existing populations. In other words, the genetic data is consistent with the idea that a small number of Middle Eastern royals could have established dynasties in Ethiopia that would have lasting genetic impact. The Beta Israel, the Ethiopian Jewish community, presents another fascinating piece of this puzzle. These are people who maintain Jewish identity and practice in isolation for over 1,000 years. When genetic studies were conducted on the Beta Israel, researchers found that while they are predominantly of African ancestry, they also carry genetic markers that connect them to Middle Eastern Jewish populations. More remarkably, some Beta Israel families show genetic patterns that suggest they may be descendants of a very small, founding population that arrived in Ethiopia during ancient times. This is exactly what we would expect to see if the legends about Israelites accompanying Menelik I were based on historical reality. But the genetic evidence extends beyond Ethiopia. In recent years, researchers have identified what they call founder effects in various populations around the world, situations where small groups of genetically related individuals established new populations that grew to significant size over time. Some of these founder effects appear to trace back to the ancient Middle East, specifically to the time period when the Israelite kingdoms were at their height. Dr. Harry Oster, a geneticist at Albert Einstein College of Medicine, has spent decades studying Jewish populations worldwide. His research has revealed that many Jewish communities, despite being separated by thousands of miles and centuries of history, share genetic markers that suggest common ancestry. More intriguingly, some of these markers appear to be concentrated in families that have maintained traditions about royal or priestly lineage. Could some of these genetic signatures trace back to the House of David? Could the bloodline of Solomon have spread far beyond Israel through marriages, diplomatic missions, and royal alliances? The genetic evidence suggests that this is not only possible, but probable. But genetics is just one piece of the puzzle. Archaeological discoveries continue to shed new light on the ancient world, revealing connections between civilizations that we never knew existed. Recent excavations in Ethiopia have uncovered evidence of sophisticated ancient trade networks that connected the Horn of Africa to the Middle East, India, and even China. The discovery of ancient inscriptions in Ethiopia written in South Arabian script, the finding of Middle Eastern artifacts in Ethiopian archaeological sites, and the identification of architectural features that show clear Middle Eastern influence all point to extensive contact between these regions during the time when the Solomonic encounters were supposed to have occurred. Perhaps most remarkably, recent excavations in Jerusalem have revealed new information about the extent and sophistication of Solomon's kingdom. The discovery of massive fortifications, elaborate water systems, and evidence of extensive international trade suggests that the biblical accounts of Solomon's wealth and influence may have been more accurate than previously believed. If Solomon's kingdom was indeed as powerful and far-reaching as the archaeological evidence suggests, then the idea that his descendants could have established dynasties in distant lands becomes much more plausible. Kings of such wealth and influence would have had the resources to send expeditions to far-off lands, to establish trade relationships, and to forge diplomatic alliances that could have resulted in royal marriages and the establishment of new dynasties. But the story doesn't end with ancient history. In the modern world, the question of Solomon's descendants has taken on new urgency and new controversy. Because we're not just dealing with academic curiosity anymore. We're dealing with real political implications, real claims to authority, and real consequences for millions of people. The Ethiopian royal family's claims to Solomonic descent have implications that extend far beyond genealogy. If these claims are true, it would mean that the promises made to the house of David, the covenants established with the kings of Israel, and the messianic prophecies connected to the Solomonic line may have a scope and significance that we've never fully understood. Some scholars have argued that the Ethiopian claims, even if they can't be proven historically, represent a form of spiritual truth that transcends mere genealogy. The idea that the wisdom of Solomon, the authority of David, and the blessings of the Israelite covenant could have taken root in Africa and flourished for thousands of years speaks to something profound about the nature of divine purpose and human destiny. But others have raised concerns about the political implications of these claims. In a world where ethnic identity and historical grievances continue to fuel conflict, the assertion that certain families or peoples have divine right to rule based on ancient bloodlines can be dangerous. The Ethiopian Revolution of 1974, which overthrew Emperor Haile Selassie, was partly motivated by rejection of these very claims. The question of Solomon's descendants also intersects with broader questions about the relationship between Africa and the Middle East, between Christianity and Judaism, and between ancient prophecy and modern reality. If the Ethiopian claims are true, it would suggest that the boundaries between these traditions are far more fluid than we've traditionally believed. Today, as we stand at the threshold of new genetic discoveries, new archaeological findings, and new historical insights, the question of Solomon's secret sons remains as compelling as ever. We have the tools to investigate these claims more thoroughly than any previous generation. We have the technology to trace genetic lineages, to analyze ancient DNA, and to peer into the past with unprecedented precision. But we also have the responsibility to approach these questions with wisdom, humility, and respect for the people whose lives and identities are bound up in these ancient stories. Whether or not the claims of Solomonic descent can be proven scientifically, they represent something profound about the human need to connect with the sacred, to find meaning in ancestry, and to locate ourselves within the grand narrative of history. The search for Solomon's sons is ultimately a search for something deeper than genealogy. It's a search for wisdom, for authority, for connection to the divine. It's a reminder that the stories we tell about our past shape our understanding of our present and our hopes for our future. As we conclude this incredible journey through time, genetics, and legend, we're left with more questions than answers. But perhaps that's exactly as it should be. Perhaps the mystery of Solomon's descendants isn't meant to be solved definitively. Perhaps it's meant to inspire us to keep searching, to keep questioning, and to keep marveling at the incredible complexity and interconnectedness of human history. What we know for certain is this: the bloodline of King Solomon, whether through direct descent or through the power of enduring legend, continues to influence our world today. From the highlands of Ethiopia to the genetic laboratories of modern universities, from the archaeological sites of ancient Jerusalem to the political councils of contemporary nations, the echo of Solomon's wisdom reverberates through time. The secret sons of Solomon may remain hidden in the mists of history, but their legacy lives on in every person who seeks wisdom, in every leader who strives for justice, and in every believer who hopes for a future where the promises of the past will be fulfilled in ways we can barely imagine. If this journey through the hidden corridors of biblical history has stirred something within you, if you've found yourself questioning what you thought you knew about the ancient world, then you've experienced exactly what we hope to share. The story of Solomon's descendants isn't just about the past. It's about the eternal human quest to understand our place in the grand tapestry of existence. Thank you for joining us on this incredible exploration. Don't forget to subscribe and hit that notification bell, because the mysteries of the ancient world are far from exhausted. There are still secrets waiting to be uncovered, still legends waiting to be investigated, and still truths waiting to be revealed. The search for Solomon's sons continues, And you're invited to be part of that search. Because in the end, we're all searching for the same thing: wisdom, purpose, and connection to something greater than ourselves. And perhaps, just perhaps, that search will lead us to discover that the bloodline of the wisest king who ever lived flows not just through the veins of Ethiopian princes, but through the heart of every person who seeks truth, justice, and the divine spark that connects us all.